If you're just joining us, you are here for the Candy Corn Guess Excel demonstration video series for our statistics course. So, welcome. Okay, in previous videos we've talked through the setup, so I'm not going to go through that, but these are all of our guesses for the number of candy corns in this jar. And we're going to go ahead and continue on with kind of analyzing our data here. So, the next thing we're going to talk about is how to create a relative frequency table in Excel. So again, we have a sample size here that we found in the last video. I'm going to start setting up this relative frequency table over here. So the relative frequency tables that we've been looking at, in particular, what we can do is have I'll say the X values or the data value that we have listed alone, and then the frequency or relative frequency in the cell next to it. However, because our data set, if you look here, we don't have very many guesses that are the exact same, which means that table would end up being very long. So again, that table would look like 120. How many guesses were there? 1. 125. How many guesses? 1. So this would kind of continue on in that way, and it would look very similar to just the data set itself. So one thing we're going to look at here is a grouped, I'll first call it a grouped frequency table, because first that's how we will start, and then we'll convert it into a relative frequency table. So here what we'll say is, I'll call it an interval. So what we're going to do is kind of decide on our own what intervals we want to work with here, just to create a grouped frequency table. And for the purpose of this video in our class, you can really think of these intervals however you want to. This is your freedom of choice to decide how large or how small you want these intervals. I'm going to notice here that our data set ranges from 120 to 1,510. In fact, maybe this is a good opportunity to point out how we can calculate the minimum and the maximum of a data set. So I'm going to go ahead and format these cells so that they will look the same. Okay, we don't really have symbols to denote the minimum or the maximum, at least that are commonly used. So I'll leave these parts blank. But Excel here, if you type equals, again, this opens up Excel for functions. If you start typing minimum, notice here you see min, and it says returns the smallest number in a set of values. So I'm going to double click that. And similarly, as in the last video when we used the count function, if you click and drag, and again, visually we can see here the minimum is 120, but I'm just showing you how to use these functions. Okay, so it'll return 120. I want to point out too, if you've taken other math courses where you've learned about functions, functions are very, 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 we talk a lot about inputs and outputs with functions, and that's why Excel is called or why these things in Excel are called functions, because we are inputting things and then Excel gives us an output for it. So just a little, I guess, side note about, I just love math. It's cool. Okay, maximum. Similarly, if you type equals and then type max, it'll say returns the largest value in a set of values. Okay, I will also take this opportunity. I've been double clicking on these the whole time. I prefer to double click on these functions to make sure that I'm actually using the function appropriately. You can go ahead and start typing the parentheses and it will assume you want to use this function. So I want to go ahead and point out that you can do it that way as well. So I will click and drag. And again, I will come back up, close my parentheses and hit enter, and it returns the maximum of our data set. Okay. So back to our grouped frequency table. I noticed that our data set ranges pretty far. So our guesses are between 120 and 1,510. So to make this grouped frequency table relatively, I'll say, to capture the data in a decent way, I might make our intervals maybe 100 in width. So I'll start here. Maybe we'll go guesses from 100 to 199, guesses from 200 to 299, guesses from 300 to 399. And I want to point out, I'm not overlapping these. So if I had typed 300 here, if someone guesses exactly 300, then we get into an argument of which which frequency or which interval does this fall into. So because our guesses here are whole numbers, I'm going ahead and making these intervals to where there is no overlap at all. Okay, so then we have 400 to 499. I'm going to pause the video and fill out the rest of these, and then we can keep going. Okay, we're back, and I have finished making these intervals here. So unless I made an error, there should be everything covered from 1,000 to 1,599. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and format this to be a table so that it just helps me visually, and I'm going to change the widths of these a little bit. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we want to look at the frequency. So how often do data values appear within each of these intervals? So right now we're wondering how many data values occur between 1,000 and 199. So there's several ways to do this. One way to do this is visually looking. So we can count if we wanted to. We could, I showed we could highlight like this and count down here. It shows 9. We could also use the count function. So, but I'm going to show you a better one, but hold on. So if we type equals, the last one I showed in the video, you could use count and highlight just the portion that you want to count. But here's a really cool one, count if. So count if says count the number of cells within a range that meet the given condition. Okay, so I'm going to select count if. And then it says range. So now it wants you to highlight our entire data set. Yeah. Okay. Then this one's slightly different. So in this one, we have multiple inputs. So far, the functions we've looked at, it's like our only input is the data set. In this one, our input is not only the data set, but also a particular criteria. So in this case, we've already highlighted the data, and then the criteria part, we are going to some things in Excel require quotes, which you'll kind of get a feel for. But if we type less than 200, so in this case, we want to make sure we don't include anything less than 100 also, but we know that there isn't a guess less than 100, so I just wanted to demonstrate this function in this way. Okay, so what this is saying is it's asking Excel to count how many data values in this data set are less than 200. So if I hit enter, it will also tell me this is 9. Yay. Okay. Another thing we can do here is again, so this one was slightly different because we could just say less than. And this one, we could use the count ifs. So this is like several conditions basically is going to be what's happening here. So count ifs. Again, what we can do is highlight all of this. And then we want to make sure that these values are greater than or equal to 200. And then we also want to make sure that these values are less than or equal to 299. But I'm just going to use less than 300. Since our data is discrete, so I'm using some vocabulary terms. Since our data is discrete here, I know that there is no value that's between 299 and 300. All of our guesses are whole numbers. So if I say less than 300, that's the same thing as saying less than or equal to 299. So this is what I'm going to do. Okay, so this function is saying for this data set, count how many data values are greater than or equal to 200 and also less than 300. Oh no. Oh, I forgot my comma. So notice too, like, and again, this happens in Excel all the time. I'm not going to edit that out of this video because I think it's important to demonstrate that we can mess up functions all the time. And Excel will tell you messed it up. Okay, so I had forgotten to insert my comma and then my parentheses around the less than 300. Okay, so now it should work. Nice. 8. So let's go count that just to make sure and so that you believe me. So between 200 and 299, we're starting here and we're going up to here. And that is certainly 8. All right. I'm going to go ahead and finish finding all of these and I will be right back. Awesome. Now we have our frequency table. So we have formed intervals that we have placed all of our data values in and then counted the frequency within each interval. So for example, here we had 2 guesses between 1,000 and 1,099. We had 3 guesses between 600 and 699. So we can go ahead and, in theory, start looking at how this data is spread out, but the point of this video is to show us how to find relative frequency and how to find it very quickly of this whole table. So Excel not only has Excel functions like the equals count if that we have used. Excel also, as I showed you in a previous video, can reference other cells, and then we can copy and paste a formula so that it will do this very quickly. So relative frequency, as a review, relative frequency is how many values, like the proportion of data values that fell into this interval out of all of the data values. So here, for example, we know that there were 9 data values within this interval from 100 to 199. So to find the relative frequency, we can take 9 and divide by 44, because that is the relative frequency. That's the proportion of guesses that were between 100 and 199. And again, that's, you can think of proportions as like part out of a whole. So 9 out of 44 guesses. Okay, this is one way to find this relative frequency, and it will automatically convert it to a decimal. I want to point out up here, we can add and take away decimals. I prefer to have decimals, and it will automatically round it for you. I usually like 3 decimal places, maybe 4 decimal places. For now, I'll leave it with 3. Okay, so this is one way to find this. But I want to point out, again, that would take a lot of time to do this for a very large data set. So instead of doing that, what we can do is click. Remember, what this is doing is now it's not saying take 9 and divide by 44. It's saying take the cell next to me and divide by 44. So if we set it up like this and hit enter, then it calculates that the same way that we just calculated it. But again, it is generalized to this formula. So now if I hover over the bottom right, and I showed this in a previous video, you can click and drag, and it will find all of your relative frequencies. So notice this is saying 0.091, and that corresponds to 4. So this is a proportion of people. That corresponds to about 9.1% of people guessed between 500 and 599. Okay, so here's our, I'm going to go ahead and merge these cells. So when you hit this button, it merges them and makes them nice and centered. I'll go ahead and write relative frequency table. Okay. That's it for this video. So the main purposes here were to show us how to kind of dive in a little bit more and then make a relative frequency table for our data. So this is one way to do it in Excel. We'll be back with more in a minute. Thank you.